Charles Price had always lived a life of luxury. As a billionaire businessman, he had everything: expensive cars, mansions, and a prestigious name. But even with all his wealth, Charles felt something was missing. The world of meetings, contracts, and deals had drained him. He yearned for something real, something that would bring his family together, away from the distractions of their rich lifestyle. So, he decided to take a break and adventure into the wilderness. He planned the perfect weekend getaway with his wife, Emma, and their young son, Ethan. They would leave the comforts of home behind and go deep into a remote jungle for a weekend of hiking and camping. Emma, always excited for new adventures, eagerly agreed. Ethan, though young, was thrilled by the idea of exploring nature, imagining all the animals and mysteries they might discover. The trio set off early on a Saturday morning. The sun was shining brightly, and the air was crisp with the freshness of the wild. As they hiked deeper into the jungle, they marveled at the towering trees and the dense underbrush that seemed to stretch on forever. It was peaceful, beautiful, and a world away from the busy streets and endless noise of the city. But as the hours passed, the peacefulness began to feel like something more, something unsettling. The jungle, once so full of life, grew eerily quiet. The birds stopped singing, the breeze slowed, and there was only the distant rustle of leaves. The deeper they went, the more they noticed the strange, almost unnatural silence. By late afternoon, Charles glanced at the sky and noticed that the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the jungle floor. They had wandered far from the main trail. "We should head back now," he said, his voice tinged with unease. But the jungle was a maze, the dense trees making it hard to find their way back. The sense of disorientation grew with every step. The trees around them looked the same, their trunks twisting in odd shapes. The sky above was now darkening, and Charles felt a shiver run down his spine. It was starting to feel less like an adventure and more like a trap. "We're lost, aren't we?" Emma asked quietly, looking around nervously. Charles didn't answer right away. He didn't want to admit it. After a while, they finally spotted something that seemed like a sign of civilization, an old, overgrown path. It wasn't much, but it was a sign of hope. They followed it, hoping it would lead them back to safety. But the path only seemed to go deeper into the jungle, taking them farther from where they started. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the air grew colder. The once vibrant jungle now seemed darker, more menacing. The shadows stretched long across the ground, and the wind began to howl through the trees, carrying with it an unsettling sound. "We need to find shelter now," Charles urged, his voice a little louder than he intended. Up ahead, they spotted something, an entrance to a cave, hidden behind thick vines and moss. At first glance, it seemed like the perfect place to shelter for the night. They could start fresh in the morning, when daylight returned. But something about the cave felt off. The entrance was dark and swallowed the light from their torches, as though it was hiding something. Still, they had no choice. "This will do for tonight," Charles said, trying to keep his voice steady. Emma didn't argue, but she hesitated for a moment before entering. Once inside, the air grew colder still. The walls of the cave were slick with moisture, and the scent of damp earth and decay filled the air. The family set up a small camp, trying to make the best of their situation. But the feeling of unease didn't fade. As they sat around the fire, the sounds of the jungle outside became more distorted. Strange rustling noises echoed from deep within the cave, and Charles's mind raced. He tried to reassure his family, but even he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The fire flickered in the cold air, casting long shadows across the walls. Ethan, tired from the hike, quickly fell asleep, curled up on a blanket. But Charles couldn't sleep. His mind kept wandering back to the sounds outside the cave. Were they just the animals of the jungle, or was something else lurking in the darkness? At one point, he heard something, soft whispers, barely audible, but unmistakable. Charles's heart skipped a beat. He froze, straining to hear. The whispers were faint, like a distant voice calling him, But when he turned to Emma, she was asleep. Ethan, too, was sound asleep. Charles sat up, his pulse quickening. He thought maybe it was just the wind playing tricks on him. But then the whispers grew louder, and he realized they were not the wind at all. They were words. Strange, unintelligible words. Suddenly, Charles felt something cold brush against his leg. His heart raced, and he jerked awake, gasping for breath. At first, he thought it was Emma's hand, or perhaps Ethan's foot, but when he opened his eyes, he saw nothing but the shadows of the cave. Then, the cold sensation returned. Something was grabbing his leg. He kicked out, but there was nothing there. His heart pounded as he quickly looked around. The cave seemed to be closing in on him, the shadows pressing in, and the whispers, now louder, more frantic, seemed to surround him. Then, a low growl echoed from deep within the cave. Charles's blood ran cold. He could feel his breath catch in his throat. The growl wasn't from an animal. It was something else. Panic surged through him. He tried to wake Emma, but her breathing was steady. Was she not hearing the sounds? Was it all in his head? Suddenly, Charles realized Ethan was missing. That he rushed to his son's side, but the boy was no longer sleeping by the fire. His heart leapt in fear. "Ethan! Ethan!" he called, his voice shaky. That he ran out of the cave, the cold night air biting at his skin. There, lying on the ground just outside the entrance, was Ethan. His eyes were closed, but his body was eerily still. "Ethan!" Charles knelt beside him, shaking him awake. The boy stirred slowly, his eyes fluttering open. But there was something strange in his gaze, a blankness, an emptiness. I don't know, Dad," Ethan mumbled. "I was just out here, but I don't know why." Charles felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He helped Ethan to his feet, his mind racing. There was something wrong, something he couldn't explain. Just then, Charles turned back toward the cave. He froze in place. There, standing in the shadows of the cave's entrance, was a figure. Tall, thin, and almost ghostly in appearance. It didn't move. It just stood there, watching them. "Emma, get out here!" Charles screamed, his voice cracking. But when Emma and Ethan rushed outside, the figure was gone. The jungle was silent again, as though nothing had happened. "I saw it," Charles cried, trying to explain. There was someone watching us. But Emma, her face pale with worry, only shook her head. "There's no one here, Charles. You're imagining things." But Charles wasn't so sure. Something wasn't right. The night dragged on, and though the jungle outside had returned to its eerie silence, the fear still clung to Charles like a suffocating fog. The figure at the cave entrance had vanished, but the terror it left behind was real. The strange whispers continued to echo in his mind, lingering in the dark corners of his thoughts. Charles paced back and forth, trying to calm himself. His family was shaken, but they hadn't experienced what he had. To them, the jungle was just an odd place, a little unsettling perhaps, but nothing to fear. Emma, still half asleep, tried to comfort Ethan, who had curled up in the corner, shivering slightly. "I just want to go home," Emma said softly, her voice filled with worry. "Maybe we should leave now, Charles. This place feels wrong." Charles looked at her, his face tense. "We can't leave, not in the middle of the night. It's too dangerous. We'll wait until morning, and then we'll figure out how to get back." But he wasn't so sure anymore. There was something about this place, about the cave, that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. It felt like the jungle itself was alive, and it had a secret, one that they weren't meant to uncover. He decided to try and get some sleep, hoping that when the morning came, everything would seem clearer. But sleep didn't come easy. Every rustle of leaves outside made his heart race. Every shadow in the cave seemed to move, twisting and stretching. He was starting to wonder if he was losing his mind. Had the stress of the trip gotten to him? Just as he was about to drift off, a soft voice broke through the darkness. "Daddy, help me." Charles's eyes shot open. Ethan was standing next to him, his face pale and his eyes wide with fear. But there was something wrong. Ethan wasn't awake. His eyes were glazed over, like he was sleepwalking, but his movements were stiff, unnatural. "Ethan? What's wrong?" Charles asked, his voice trembling. But Ethan didn't answer. Instead, he pointed toward the back of the cave, his finger trembling. Charles felt a chill run through him. There, in the farthest corner of the cave, a shadow moved. It wasn't the shape of any animal Charles had ever seen. It was tall and thin, with long, twisted limbs that didn't seem to belong to any living creature. Before Charles could say anything, the shadow began to glide closer, slowly and silently, like it was floating toward them. Charles grabbed Ethan, pulling him away from the figure, but the boy didn't resist. It was as if he was in some sort of trance. "Emma, get up!" Charles screamed, shaking his wife awake. "Get Ethan! Get out of here!" But Emma didn't move. She was frozen, staring at the shadow in the corner, her eyes wide with fear. It was as if the figure was controlling her too, pulling her into its gaze. The whispering grew louder, and this time, it wasn't just a murmur. It was a chorus of voices, chanting something in an ancient language Charles couldn't understand. The words felt like they were scratching at his mind, trying to break through. Suddenly, Ethan screamed. It wasn't a scream of terror, but of agony. His body jerked, as if something was pulling him in different directions. "Ethan!" Charles cried out, but his son wasn't responding. Instead, he was staring ahead with a look of pure terror on his face, his mouth open as if he were trying to scream, but no sound came out. Charles felt the coldest chill yet. Something was happening to his son. The shadows in the cave twisted, and Charles could see them forming into shapes, faces, hands, bodies, all contorted and twisted, staring back at him. "Make it stop!" Emma shouted, her voice breaking. "Please make it stop!" Charles, panicked and desperate, grabbed his flashlight and shined it into the shadows, but the beam flickered and went out. The cave seemed to grow darker, colder. The whispering voices surrounded them now, and they felt like they were closing in, suffocating the air around them. Then, just as Charles thought they were doomed, the shadow stopped. It hovered there, watching them with its hollow, empty gaze. The voices ceased, and for a moment, everything was still. But the silence was more terrifying than any sound. Charles, sweating and trembling, grabbed Ethan, pulling him away from the figure. "We need to get out of here. Now." But just as they turned to leave, a voice, deep, cold, and ancient, spoke from the darkness. "You cannot leave. You are already marked." Charles's blood ran cold. The voice wasn't human, and it carried a weight of power, of something far older than he could comprehend. Without warning, the cave shook. The ground beneath them trembled, and the walls seemed to close in. Rocks fell from the ceiling, dust filling the air. The cave was alive, angry that they had disturbed it. Emma screamed, pulling Ethan close to her, but Charles couldn't move. He was frozen, staring at the shadow figure that was now standing directly in front of him. It was taller now, its face almost completely featureless except for two glowing eyes. And it smiled. The smile sent a shiver down his spine, but it was the sound that followed that filled him with dread, a low, guttural growl, almost as if the cave itself was growling in hunger. Charles turned and ran, pulling his family with him, but the path back to the entrance was blocked. The cave had sealed itself off, trapping them inside. "No!" Charles screamed, pounding on the walls. "We have to get out of here. We have to." But before he could finish, the walls around them began to shift. Faces appeared in the stone, their mouths open in silent screams. It was as if the cave itself was showing them the souls of those who had come before, those who had been trapped by the curse. Charles felt a heavy hand on his shoulder. He whipped around, and to his horror, He saw Ethan standing there, staring at him with empty, black eyes. "Daddy," Ethan whispered, his voice no longer his own. "Help me." Charles's heart shattered. He knew that his son was no longer the boy he loved. He had been taken, just like the others. "No, no," Emma cried, falling to her knees. But it was too late. The cave began to collapse around them, the shadows rising, reaching for them. The whispering returned, louder now, filling their minds, until all they could hear was the sound of their own screams, swallowed up by the darkness. As the walls closed in on them, Charles realized the truth. The cave wasn't just cursed, it was hungry, and it had claimed another family. The jungle was silent again. The voices had stopped, but the curse of the cave lived on, waiting for the next soul to wander too far.